Buenos días, estamos esperando que se incorporen las personas. Camila.
Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Vamos a iniciar este encuentro, el segundo encuentro virtual, esperando unos minutos para que se vayan conectando más gente. Bueno, en honor al tiempo, les queremos dar la bienvenida. Mi nombre es Camila Rojas y en nombre de la Facultad de Psicología quiero darles la bienvenida al segundo encuentro virtual sobre enseñanza, aprendizaje y evaluación en educación superior. Hoy les presentamos el panel 1, Pensando en la educación superior en tiempos de incertidumbre y cambio. Los invitamos a participar de esta actividad realizando sus preguntas a lo largo de ella en la sección preguntas y respuestas que está en la barra inferior de Zoom. Les pedimos que el chat lo usen solamente en caso de problemas técnicos. Además les comento que esta actividad cuenta con traducción simultánea y para activarla deben apretar el botón en forma de globo terráqueo que se encuentra en la barra inferior de Zoom. Al pincharlo aparecerán arriba 3 opciones de canales de audio: apagado, inglés y español, y deben elegir la opción que más les acomode. Finalmente, comentar que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal de streaming de la universidad, udtv.ud.cl, y que durante las próximas semanas estará disponible el video de esta actividad en educacionsuperior.ud.cl. Esperamos que hoy la tecnología y las conexiones nos acompañen, pero les pedimos consideración si es que tuviésemos algún problema técnico durante el seminario. Comentarles también que tras esta presentación pueden participar de nuestras redes sociales, @psicologiaUDD. Dejo con ustedes a Daniela Bruna.
Camila. Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Verónica Villarroel. Vamos a esperar unos minutos que se conecten más personas. Ya en estos momentos estamos recién iniciando la actividad, por lo tanto vamos a esperar un par de minutos que las personas se conecten. Así que te pido, Camila, atención para aceptar a todas las personas. En estos momentos tenemos aún poquititos personas que se están incorporando. Entonces primero quiero saludarlos a todos en este encuentro internacional en educación superior, nuestro segundo encuentro. Vamos a comenzar con nuestro primer panel en unos minutos, pero queremos tener un poquitito de tiempo para que las personas se puedan incorporar. Para las personas que no hablan en español, quiero decirles que tenemos traducción simultánea, y tanto a las personas también que hablan español para el inglés, y voy a poner en el chat algunas indicaciones para que ustedes puedan poner atención, ¿ya? Seguramente para los que han estado en encuentros anteriores, recuerdan que al lado, al inferior de la pantalla, hay hay una barra, y donde al final de esa barra aparece un mundo, ¿cierto? Y en ese icono de globo terráqueo, ustedes lo aprietan y ponen el lenguaje en que quieren escuchar, ¿ya? Eh, Ahí aparece en el chat la información en español y en inglés, así que por favor, para los que puedan empezar a escuchar en el idioma que quieren escuchar, por favor hagan el clic en el globo terráqueo en el lenguaje que ustedes quieren escuchar. Vamos a esperar unos minutitos. Camila, por favor, estar atenta a aceptar a las personas. Eh, Bien, vamos a esperar los últimos minutos para dar las instrucciones. Bien, en honor al tiempo vamos a comenzar, entonces voy a contarles un poquitito de esta actividad. Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Quiero ver si estoy con el audio. Sí, perfecto. Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Mi nombre, como dije anteriormente, es Verónica Villarroel, directora del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación. Y a nombre de la Facultad de Psicología de la Universidad del Desarrollo, quiero darles la bienvenida al segundo encuentro internacional virtual en enseñanza, aprendizaje y evaluación en educación superior. Hoy es nuestro primer día de transmisión de esta actividad que vamos a realizar durante toda la semana y la siguiente hasta el día miércoles. Y antes de comenzar, quiero nuevamente darles indicaciones respecto a la traducción simultánea de este evento. Esto que les voy a contar también está escrito en el chat. Les voy a pedir a Alexandra que lo vuelva a poner y se los voy a leer. Dice: para seleccionar la interpretación simultánea, deben seleccionar el icono del globo terráqueo que van a encontrar en la barra inferior de su panel. Al pinchar, seleccionen el idioma en que quieren escuchar toda la actividad, sin importar el idioma en que hable el expositor. Estaremos pendientes al chat por cualquier problema o ayuda que necesiten, ¿ya? Y ahí aparecen las indicaciones, ¿cierto? Que está el globo terráqueo en la parte final de la barra inferior. Los invitamos a participar de esta actividad realizando sus preguntas y a lo largo de ellas en la sección preguntas y respuestas que está en la barra inferior del Zoom pueden hacerlas. Y les pedimos que el chat solamente lo usen en caso de problemas técnicos, ¿ya? Entonces, la idea es que en el icono que dice preguntas y respuestas, que es question and answers, ¿cierto? Ustedes puedan hacer todas las preguntas porque vamos a seleccionar de esas preguntas la ronda final de preguntas a los panelistas. Les comento que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal de streaming de la universidad y que durante los últimos días enviaremos el video y el PowerPoint a todos los participantes inscritos y también van a estar subidos en la página web donde ustedes se inscribieron. Esperamos que la tecnología y las conexiones, como dijo Camila en un inicio, nos acompañen, pero obviamente les pedimos consideración si tenemos algún problema técnico durante la charla. Agradecemos a los inscritos e interesados en participar y los invitamos a informarse de todas nuestras actividades en la web de psicología.udd.cl y en nuestras redes sociales @psicologiaudd. Vamos a dar inicio a esta actividad con unas palabras de bienvenida. En esta oportunidad vamos a recibir el saludo de la doctora Daniela Bruna, que es directora del pregrado de Psicología en Concepción. Daniela representa a la Facultad de Psicología de nuestra universidad y también es investigadora docente del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación, CIME, de nuestra facultad y universidad. Te doy la bienvenida, Daniela, y te dejo para que nos saludes.
I can't hear Daniela. Am I supposed to be able to hear her? I can't hear Daniela. Am I supposed to be able to hear her?
Está. Wait a minute. Daniela, 2 veces te silenciaste. Sí, se escucha bien.
I still can't hear anything. I still can't hear anything. I can't hear anything.
Es extraño. Camila, te pido que lo veas, por favor, porque ninguno de las personas que están escuchando la traducción la escuchan. Y los que estamos con español, yo la estoy escuchando. Ya, ahora Roberta dice que puede escucharla. Alexandra. Sí, yo te escucho. Sandra y Gonzalo. No se escucha nada, Gonzalo. Ahí se los entreto escuchamos y estamos interpretando los canales de inglés. ¿Ya? Ya. Daniela, no sé si puedes traducir esto, porque no sé si me escuchan a mí, Dan, y los que hablan en inglés. Ah, ya. Sí, escuchan en inglés lo que yo digo, la que no escuchan es a Daniela. Entonces, sí, me escuchan a mí y no escuchan a Daniela. Perfecto. Entonces, quizás hay algo en la traducción de Daniela que quizás no se activó. Yo le digo a los traductores y a Camila. Pero hasta ahora lo que ha hecho Daniela es darnos un saludo y presentar algunos datos de la universidad respecto a nuestros avances y desarrollos en términos de investigación y y de desarrollo en el cine, ¿ya? No sé qué pasará que justo... acá parece que Sandra y Daniela están como intérpretes y no deberían estar como intérpretes. Alexandra y Daniela. Camila, Alexandra y Daniela están como intérpretes y no deberían estar asignadas como intérpretes, entonces no las escuchan. Hay que arreglar eso. Le voy a pedir a los hablantes en inglés que por favor tengan un poquitito de paciencia. Daniela va a terminar su presentación, que es solo un saludo inicial, y una vez que Daniela termine no van a haber problemas porque hay un tema de asignación que hay que solucionar, ¿ya? Pero vamos a empezar prontamente con Jennifer y ahí no van a haber problemas. Bien, Daniela, si puedes terminar. No te escuchas, estás silenciada. Ahora sí. No te escuchas. No.
Okay.
No te escuchas nada, Daniela. Daniela, te pido disculpas.
Okay, my system is working fine now. Thank you.
Ok. Daniela, te pido disculpas, pero tenemos un problema técnico que vamos a tener que solucionar después, y si no te escuchas en español y en inglés, no tiene sentido, ¿ya? Entonces, vamos a comenzar con Jennifer Gindley, ¿ya? Voy a presentarla porque vamos a comenzar con su presentación. Inicia su ponencia entonces la doctora Jennifer Gindley con su presentación titulada Educación postformal para futuros complejos. La doctora Jennifer Gindley es psicóloga, es educadora e investigadora de Futures Research. Actualmente es profesora adjunta en el Institute for Sustainable Futures, UTS Sydney. Es profesora adjunta de Southern Cross University, Fellow de Boyden Center en España, y es visitante en algunas actividades de Science Pro en Francia. Fue presidenta de la Federación Mundial de Estudios del Futuro, de la UNESCO y de la ONU ECOSOC. En esa cátedra dirigió un organismo de máxima audiencia mundial que representa a 300 de los académicos de futuro más importantes del mundo. Bien, les pido disculpas por los problemas técnicos que hemos tenido, espero que se vayan solucionando rápidamente, y quiero dar la bienvenida a Jennifer. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, y vamos a estar atentas al chat cualquier duda. Que estén muy bien.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Thank you very much, Veronica, and the translator. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm just going to hide my little floating controls so I can easily move from one slide to the next. So I'm delighted to be speaking at this conference on post-formal education for complex futures of uncertainty and volatility. I'll be presenting a rather big picture overview of this topic. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is 21st century challenges under the topic of Vuca. Then I'll talk about evolving consciousness in a Vuca world. And then I'm going to talk about, thirdly, post-formal education for complex futures, life, love, wisdom, and voice. So first of all, what are the 21st century Vuca challenges? Vuca is a term that was coined by the US Defense Department in 1990 and was taken up by the business world in leadership programs all around the world. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I'm wondering how higher education is dealing with a Vuca world. I see the major Vuca challenges for the higher education of the 21st century as being, for volatility, we have a climate emergency. For uncertainty, we have growing inequality. And for complexity, we have exponential technology growth. And for ambiguous, we are living in a post-truth world. So there's Vuca challenges. Climate emergency, how do we educate for this? Growing inequality, how do we counter this? Exponential technology, how do we keep it human in this world? And in a post-truth world, how do we educate young people for discernment? The first Vuca challenge, volatility related to climate emergency. How do we educate for this? We've got melting glaciers, rising sea levels, mass climate migration. Climate change has been blamed for the forest fires, the wildfires all around the world being double what they were in previous years. Wildfires, superstorms, sea level rise. Climate crisis is leading us to the brink of ecosystem collapse. Over 3 billion people are at risk of rising sea levels, and 7 million people were displaced just in the first half of 2019. So what values have caused this? I believe we've forgotten how to value life, the environment, and our collective future. What kind of education can turn climate crisis around? We'll return to this question later on. The second challenge, growing inequality, creates so much uncertainty in people. How do we counter this? Here's Jeff Bezos, one of the world's richest men, and there's his $165 million Beverly Hills mansion. But many of his Amazon staff are on food stamps. How do we deal with this? We have the 5 big tech companies, Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft. They have a combined net worth exceeding $3 trillion US. Here's Apple's 5 billion, largest office block on earth. While in other parts of the world, wealth disparity increases, racial prejudice is still ongoing, and homelessness abounds. In the Oxfam 2020 report on inequality, we hear that the world's richest 1% have more than twice the wealth of the rest of humanity combined. It's quite obscene, I think. So what values underlie this challenge? We've forgotten how to value each other. Greed dominates, and a lack of care for our fellow human beings. What kind of education could counter inequality? We'll explore this question in part 3 as well. Thirdly, exponential technology creates such complexity. This is Vuca Challenge 3, complexity. So how do we keep it human? Digital addiction is very common among young people. Amongst voicemail, chat rooms, talking toys, the least valued of evolutionary forces is the human voice. Without it, believe it or not, little children cannot even learn to speak. Another sign of exponential technologies, we have AI and what's called the singularity. The singularity is believed to be when our intelligence becomes trillions of times more powerful than it is today and increasingly non-biological. But many tech-savvy researchers now claim that AI is not intelligent. Here's Kate Crawford. She's a researcher and a digital researcher. She's worked with Microsoft for many years, and she's the author of an amazing book called The Atlas of AI. I'd recommend it to everyone. She says that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. There's a big myth around AI. She's the author and co-founder of the AI Now Institute in New York. We have brain-computer interface, Elon Musk's neural lace, imagined on the right, the digital layer above the cortex. Very big research dollars are being spent on brain-computer interface. But is it real? We're in an age where human intelligence and computer processing could be cohabiting in all sorts of unexpected ways in the next few years. So how can we keep it human for young people? What is valued with exponential technology? The exponential development of technology is about greed, especially in Silicon Valley. There's no question about that. And it's about undervaluing humanity, human qualities. So what kind of education can help to keep it human? We'll explore this later as well. The fourth Vuca challenge, we live in a post-truth world. This is all about ambiguity. How do we educate in a post-truth world? How do we educate for discernment, to see through media monopolies, where media monopolies are able to manipulate state and national elections? How do we educate for discernment, to navigate echo chambers, when many children and young people spend many hours a day in social media echo chambers, more time than with their families. Finally, how do we educate for discernment to recognize fake news when our politicians, who are supposed to be society's leaders, are caught out lying, manipulating, and spinning the truth? What values are lacking here? What I see is a lack of discernment. There's a proliferation of information through the mass media, but young people don't know how to make sense of it. What kind of education can help to develop discernment? We will address this question in the third section. So to summarize this first part of the presentation, the VUCA challenges of volatility from climate emergency, uncertainty through growing inequality, complexity of exponential of technology, and the ambiguity of living in a post-truth world. So now we move into part 2, evolving consciousness in a VUCA world. There are 2 streams to evolution of consciousness. The first one is cultural evolution, where we're seeing an emerging integral culture. The second is psychological development, where we're seeing the emergence of post-formal adult reasoning. Cultural evolution shows us that humans have always evolved culturally over millennia. In 18th century Europe, we had the German idealists such as Goethe and Schelling speaking about and writing about, philosophizing about evolution of consciousness and even conscious evolution. But in the 19th century in Europe, evolution was hijacked by Darwinism. So evolution suddenly became known as just a biological thing, with no relation to the full human being and the full human development, or Bildung, as it's called in Germany. But in the 20th century, in Europe, we had Rudolf Steiner from 1914 and Sri Aurobindo in India from Steiner from 1904 and Sri Aurobindo from India from 1914, reintroducing the idea that the evolution of consciousness is complex and integrated and has a spiritual dimension. From the mid-20th century, this is carried further by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Jean Gebser. We'll talk more about Jean Gebser now. He was one of the most significant cultural historians of the 20th century. He wrote an important book called The Ever-Present Origin, a very seminal book on cultural history and cultural evolution. He spoke of 5 stages of cultural evolution, or what he called mutations of consciousness, from the very early prehistory, what he called archaic consciousness, to the Ice Age and Agrarian Age, magic consciousness, then mythic consciousness, from the Agrarian Age to the Philosophical Age of ancient Greece, around 800 BCE. This is when the mental rational mode began, when philosophers and mathematicians and the alphabet was created, and this carried on until the Renaissance around 1500. So according to Gebser, it was in the Renaissance that integral consciousness first emerged, and that type of consciousness, which integrates all our previous modes of consciousness, will be continuing on now into the present time and on into the future, and it's strongly emerging in the present era. Now we're switching to psychological development. So cultural evolution is really the development of the species. But psychological development is about the development of the individual. Jean Piaget is a key figure here, one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century. In his book, The Child's Construction of Reality, he spoke about 4 stages of cognitive development. He theorized and experimented and discovered that there were 4 cognitive stages that a child goes through before they reach adulthood. The sensory motor stage in the infant, the pre-operational stage in years 2 to 6, then concrete operations through 7 to 12 years, and finally formal operations from 12 to 18 years during adolescence. But Piaget stopped there. He believed that formal operations was the highest stage of consciousness, of cognitive development that we developed as adults. he did suggest that maybe there was something more, but he didn't really develop it. So this was left for the adult developmental psychologists, particularly in the US from the 70s, who came up with the concept of post-formal reasoning or mature adult reasoning. And the most significant psychologist here that I'm aware of is Jan Sinnott. She wrote a very important book on the development of logic in adulthood about post-formal thought and its application. She recognized, along with many other psychologists, that human development, adult cognitive development, psychological development didn't stop at formal operations. It didn't stop at binary logic. It went further, and she spoke about complexity, creativity, paradox, and numerous other qualities, which we'll speak about in a minute. So if we want to look at the combined big picture of evolving culture and psychology, we need to look at John Gibson with his archaic, magic, mythical, mental, and integral cultural evolution, and sensory motor, and Piaget's sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, and formal operations. But Piaget didn't have an equivalent to Gibbs's integral cultural evolution. So what it required was psychologists such as Jan Sinnott to come up with post-formal operations. Then in the 21st century, the evolution of consciousness has been further developed by a number of people, integral theorists such as Ken Wilber, adult developmental psychologists such as Jan Sinnott, transdisciplinary theorists such as Irvin Laszlo and Edgar Morin, and futures researchers such as myself. So the important thing to know about evolving consciousness in the 21st century is that in our current era, advanced individuals are in transition from the dominance of formal thinking or formal binary logic to the emergence of more complex, creative, integrative, or post-formal logics. And this is where we need to really wake up as higher educators, that we need to educate young people for this transition from formal thinking to more complex ways of thinking. So to summarize this second part, evolving consciousness has two streams: integral cultural evolution and post-formal cultural development. So now we're moving on to the third part, where we'll talk about post-formal education for complex futures: life, love, voice, and wisdom. And I hope all the translation is working well. I haven't seen any chat sessions or anything saying that it's not, so I have to assume that it is. To understand post-formal education, we need to take a closer look at post-formal reasoning. So during my PhD, the focus of my PhD, which was on evolving education, was to look at the work of the adult developmental psychologists who were working with this concept of post-formal reasoning. There were a number of psychologists working from the 70s to the 90s and beyond, and they came up with a couple of dozen qualities, features, characteristics that they said represented higher functioning adults who'd moved beyond formal reasoning. And I distilled these qualities into 12 what I call post-formal reasoning qualities: complexity, creativity, dialogical reasoning, ecological reasoning, futures reasoning, and higher purpose, imagination, integration, intuitive wisdom, reflexivity, language reflexivity, pluralism, and reflexivity. Now, don't worry about having to take all of this in. I'm going to be passing on my PowerPoint, and there'll be a few additional pieces in the PowerPoint as well that I won't have time to go through. So if you're interested, you can study this further afterwards. Then the next thing I did was I looked at all the emerging innovative educational approaches that were happening around the late 20th century. And I found, again, a couple of dozen really interesting approaches, little pockets of people working here and there around the world on things like wisdom education, imaginative education, social and emotional education. And then what I did was I looked at them together. I looked at the 12 post-formal reasoning qualities, and I also distilled all of the different innovative new, what I call evolutionary pedagogies, and they matched up remarkably well with these higher post-formal reasoning. So this indicated to me that we're moving into a new evolutionary stage with education, and that although it's not fully coherent for many people, there are people all over the world working in one or other or several of these qualities to try and develop higher functioning and higher reasoning in the children that they educate. So I mapped this onto a chart, and I found that all of these educational, all of these different innovative educational pedagogies fell under 4 themes: wisdom, life, love, and voice. And that's what I'm going to talk about now in more detail. I think we've still got enough time to go through all this. So I'll start with pedagogical life. What is it? It's about revitalizing education through imagination and organic thinking. And there are various educational approaches that do enliven and revitalize education. These include imaginative education, ecological, environmental, and sustainable education, futures and foresight education. These all help to revitalize education. And educating with pedagogical life cultivates mobile life-enhancing thinking in adults. So it develops these post-formal reasoning qualities of imagination, ecological reasoning, and futures reasoning. Now, the interesting thing is that this volatility of climate emergency that we spoke about as one of the Vuca challenges, and we said, how do we educate for this? Well, I believe that the pedagogies of life, imagination, and ecological and futures education will help to turn around climate crisis because they develop an ecological sensibility in young people. So this is the key to volatility of climate emergency. Next, we have pedagogical love. This is about contemplative love, or a type of critical reverence and respect. It's not indulging students or young people, it's a critical reverence and respect. And the approaches to education that are relevant here are spiritual, transformative, and contemplative education, social and emotional education, and integral and holistic education. And what they develop is a conscious, compassionate, spiritual development in young people, which lead to a sense of higher purpose, a dialogical reasoning where the other is understood, and a kind of integrative reasoning or holistic reasoning. And this is key when you're talking about the uncertainty, the Vuca challenge of uncertainty related to growing inequality. How do we counter this with education? I believe the pedagogies of love, by developing compassion, will help to balance the growing inequality we're seeing in the world. So those pedagogies that are spiritual, social and emotional and holistic will all help here. Thirdly, pedagogical voice. This is all about finding your voice, finding your language self-awareness, and it's empowering you as well. It's about multivocal approaches. So it's about multi-perspectival approaches, postmodern and post-structuralist points of view, aesthetic, artistic and poetic education, critical, post-colonial, global and planetary. These are all different approaches, educational approaches, which people are practicing all around the world. There's 9 approaches there. They all help to develop different perspectives, multi-perspectivality. And that is what I cohere under pedagogical voice. And it helps to develop linguistic, paradigmatic, and cultural boundary crossing. It develops reflexivity or self-awareness and language awareness, and a sense of pluralism or pluralistic perspectives. Now, what is this going to help with? It's going to help with the complexity that is around us, surrounding us with exponential technology, because it helps to humanize the pedagogies of voice by getting to understand other points of view, critical, planetary, postmodern points of view. It helps to keep it human. It helps to understand not only our own voice, but the voices of others. And that is empowering for everybody. So that will help us to deal with the complexity of exponential technology and keep it human. Fourthly, pedagogical wisdom. What's that about? Creative wisdom is about waking up to multiplicity. Wisdom is about holding multiple perspectives at the same time. And these multimodal approaches help to create discernment. So by educating to develop creativity in education, complexity in education, there's even a particular approach of wisdom education itself. All of these approaches help to develop a complexification of thinking and culture, an understanding of complex thinking, systems thinking, creativity, understanding things from different points of view, and eventually leading to a kind of intuitive wisdom that comes with discernment. So the kind of ambiguity that young people are faced with in a post-truth world, and we ask, how do we educate for discernment? Well, I believe that these, excuse me, I'm having a little problem here with there we go. I believe the pedagogies of wisdom, the multimodal education of developing creativity and complex thinking, helps to develop wise discernment. And that's what young people need in a post-truth world. They need discernment to distinguish fake news from authentic truth. So now, to summarize this part 3, post-formal education for complex futures, what we've seen is that, in my view, pedagogical life, it regenerates, it's regenerative, and it counters the volatility of climate emergency. Pedagogical love grows compassion, so it helps to balance the uncertainty of growing inequality. Pedagogical voice empowers and humanizes, so it helps us to deal with the complexity of exponential technology. And finally, pedagogical wisdom builds discernment and therefore reduces the ambiguity of a post-truth world. So to summarize the whole talk, we looked at the Vuca challenges of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and we saw how they manifest in the world through all these major challenges. We looked at how consciousness is evolving, both culturally and individually in terms of our own psychology, but we need to work on it consciously. And we've seen how the pedagogies of life, love, wisdom, and voice can help to turn around these major VUCA challenges that we're facing in this world of uncertainty and complexity. So if anyone's interested in any further reading about any of this, my book, Post-Formal Education, is really the expression of in great detail and comprehensiveness of all of this work that I've just been talking about. I've tried to compress an enormous amount of work into just a half an hour, so apologies for the rush. But if you're interested in any of this and understanding further and more about this, then my book, Post-Formal Education, you'll find very helpful in illuminating these points further. My book, The Future, A Very Short Introduction, is an introduction to the future studies field and long-term thinking, and it discusses the evolution of the future studies field. And I look at human-centered futures versus technotopian futures. And I also look at the grand global futures challenges and how we can turn them around. And thirdly, in my book, The Secret to Growing Brilliant Children, is a focus on my work in Steiner education and how Steiner or Waldorf education can be brought forward in a way to be in conversation with the other innovative pedagogies of the 21st century. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jennifer. Pones en discusión temas que son muy interesantes y muy complejos, ¿cierto? Como que estamos viviendo en esta era. Entonces seguramente hay preguntas que van a aparecer y que tienen que ver con cómo trasladar esto y cómo enfrentar esta enseñanza en educación superior, ¿ya? Vamos ahora a... Así que te agradezco mucho tu presentación porque fue una buena introducción a los desafíos que estamos enfrentando. Vamos ahora a escuchar la ponencia de Trini Jensen, titulada El impacto del COVID en educación superior y el futuro de la enseñanza y el aprendizaje. Trini Jensen es máster en ciencias de los medios de la Universidad de Aarhus en Dinamarca. Ocupa actualmente el cargo de gerente de educación superior y transformación digital en la Asociación Internacional de Universidades. Lidera el trabajo sobre la prioridad estratégica en transformación digital, donde encabeza proyectos que abarcan formulación de políticas, estrategia, promoción y seguimiento de la transformación digital en la educación superior con socios globales. Es autora del informe de seguimiento global sobre la educación superior en la era digital, el estado actual de la transformación en todo el mundo, que se publicó en enero del 2020. Bienvenida, Trini. Trini, puedes comenzar.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you for the invitation and this opportunity to share a bit some of the work of the International Association of Universities. So before I start my presentation, I just wanted to very briefly highlight who we are as a global university association. We were created by UNESCO in 1950. So we were very pleased to celebrate 70 years of existence last year, and we are still continuing the celebrations. And basically the main aim of our association is to bring higher education institutions together across the globe. We currently have more than 600 members from some 120 countries around the world, and we engage in different ways in order to create this global platform for exchange among leaders and experts in higher education from across the world. Our activities are mainly structured around 4 strategic priorities of us. You see them below on the slide. So values-based leadership, internationalization of higher education. We're very much engaged in the sustainable development agenda as well. And then fourthly, we work on digital transformation, and that's the specific area that I am leading. I also want to mention before we go into the presentation that the IAU is maintaining and updating the World Higher Education Database, which is an online portal that you'll find online on web.net. And it's a database of more than 20,000 higher education institutions worldwide that are accredited by their national competent bodies. So I think that that is also a very interesting tool for people who are internationally engaged and wishes to learn more. So this was just a few words about IAU, but I will of course be willing to tell much more if you're interested, so do not hesitate to reach out. Today in this presentation, I would like to do 2 things. In the first part, I would like to share with you some of the results of the global survey that IAU has conducted this year. It is the second in a series in order to assess the impact of the pandemic of higher education. We are working very hard to get the report out. It's not yet ready, but it's coming soon. So at least here I'll have the opportunity to present some of the findings of this survey. In the second part of my talk, I'll just share a few thoughts on how I believe that this impacts the future of higher education, and most particularly teaching and learning. So let's dive into it. This second global survey, as I said, was conducted 1 year into the pandemic. So we collected data from February to June this year, but it was a follow-up to a first survey that was done really at the outset of the pandemic. We did a very short survey in April 2020, which led to a first report in May 2020, and that report is available on our website and open access. You can find that one if you're interested. It was a very short survey, the first one, and therefore we felt that 1 year into the pandemic, it was time to conduct a more comprehensive survey, really looking at different aspects across higher education institutions in order to assess what is the impact of the pandemic on higher education. We look at higher education from the institutional perspective. That is, we ask leadership to provide data on the different questions in the survey, which is very broad, from governance questions on financing, on enrollment, to teaching and learning. We're looking at research, community engagement. So a huge amount of data that we've been collecting, and more than 75 questions in the overall survey. We were able to get replies for some almost 500 higher education institutions in some 112 countries around the world. And when we look at the distribution of the data, because of course we're interested in looking at the state of higher education from a global perspective, but we are also interested in looking at it from the different regions. So we've been able to analyze the data, bringing the data down into 4 different regions. We work with the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Pacific. And here on the screen, you can see how it compares to the data of the World Higher Education Database that I was mentioning. So we have a quite good spread. The only thing that I want to highlight is that we do have very few responses from Northern America, which means that the data from the Americas is really mainly representing Latin America and the Caribbean. So as I was saying, we're covering a very broad spectrum of aspects of higher education in this survey. So we're looking at governance, teaching, learning, research, community engagement. But in this presentation, I will focus mainly on a few of the questions in the governance and teaching and learning section. But if you're interested, then please go get the report once it's available, hopefully in January next year. So first part, let's have a look at the impact in terms of revenue. And in order to do so in the most simplistic way, we divided funding sources into 4 main categories: public funding and tuition fees on one side. That's the main funding sources for higher education. And then on the other side, we're also looking at private sector funding and other income. I mean, of course, not all institutions have all types of funding sources. So what you see here is that we are comparing those who are concerned by the different types of funding sources. So what do we see? First of all, we do see at the global level that the majority of the institutions are reporting stability in terms of income, but we also see quite an important share of institutions experiencing a decrease. Almost a third of the institutions are receiving public funding are experiencing a decrease in public funding, and 40% are experiencing a decrease in tuition fees. On the other hand, you see that there is more tendency towards an increase in public funding compared to tuition fees. On the other side, however, in terms of private sector funding and other income, it is the majority of the institutions that are experiencing a decrease in funding. So although that there is some kind of resilience and stability, we still see that there is 1 year into the pandemic, an important impact on revenue of higher education. Let's see how that translates by region. I just developed this in terms of public funding and tuition fees. So here again, you see we have the 4 regions, and in Europe, there is quite a few, 60%, reporting stability in income, and there is even 23% of the institution experiencing an increase in public funding during this first year of pandemic. However, when we compare to Africa and the Americas, it is almost half of the institutions that are experiencing a decrease in public funding. So this is a very divergent picture in terms of how the pandemic is impacting the different regions. Again, switching to tuition fees, we have Asia and the Pacific and Europe, with more than the majority of the institution saying that there is a stable level of income in terms of tuition fees. And again, here we see that on the other hand, in Africa and in the Americas, the majority of the institutions are actually experiencing a decrease in the tuition fees. Our survey does not allow us to see to what extent that they are experiencing a decrease. We are really just measuring the trends and pointers towards what is happening in terms of the income streams. We also, on the other hand, looked at the picture in terms of expenditures. And again, we divided it into a series of different categories of expenditures. And what you see at the global level is that for the majority of the different categories identified, there is a good base of resilience or same level of expenditures. Mostly those universities engaged in health activities, for example, university hospitals and others, are seeing a high increase in expenditures, which is logic or normal in the context of a global health pandemic and crisis. But on the other hand, I think it's interesting to note as well that there is a high decrease, not only in international collaboration and activities, which is also expected in the context of the pandemic, where it has been much more difficult to organize international activities, to cross borders and to attend conferences and other activities, but also a decrease in expenditure on community engagement. And to this conference, I also brought up the table on expenditures in the Americas, just to highlight how some of them are a little bit different from the global picture. And I wanted to highlight this one particularly on research. In the Americas, 42% of the institutions are reporting that there is a decrease in expenditures on research. I think this is another important thing to follow very carefully moving forward. Is this the effect of delays due to the pandemic, or is it the beginning of change in priorities in terms of funding and reduced funding? This will have to be carefully monitored moving forward. In the Americas as well, we see a higher proportion of institutions seeing a decrease in expenditures relating to staff costs, which for other regions are one of the categories that is the most stable, which means that there is either a decrease in staff or staff is working for less. So this is another aspect which will be very important to monitor moving forward. This was a question that we included in order to ask the leader of higher education institutions to what extent that they're concerned about the financial sustainability of higher education of their institutions around the world. And I brought up the 4 different regions again here, and you see that in Europe, for example, 44% of the institutions are not really concerned about the future of their institutions. But on the other hand, in the other regions, you have the majority of the institutions expressing that they're somewhat concerned. And if we add up the 2 positive categories and the 2 negative categories, we more or less find the opposite situation between Europe, where 65% of the institutions are quite confident, whereas in Africa, 61% of the institutions are concerned about the financial future of their institutions. And this also concerns almost half of the institutions in the Americas. When we look at domestic student enrollment, I did not include the one on international students because it will not be a surprise to you that we have seen a very high decrease in international students, but I found that it was still interesting to show you the graph on domestic student enrollment. In all regions of the world, we do have the majority of the institutions reporting stability, but you will at the same time see that we have a higher proportion of institutions in Africa, in the Americas, reporting a decrease in domestic student enrollment, where this is as low as 13% in Europe. When we look at the increase, it's more or less the other way around. We have more than a third of the institutions in Europe reporting an increase in student enrollment, whereas this concerns only 16% in Africa. So this really provides a picture of, at the same time, to some extent, resilience, but also that the impact is very diverse among regions, and that particularly regions that are very reliant on private higher education institutions and tuition fees are more at risk compared to those systems which are maybe more traditionally public funded. So some trends of concern, or at least a picture of what higher education institutions are confronted with in order to ensure that higher education, the higher education offer across the different regions. We had a series of questions as well on the impact on human resources, both in terms of salaries and in terms of recruitment and layoffs. But the slide that I wanted to show you here, because in the other categories, it was the majority of institutions expressing stability to what extent, to some extent, even though we do see a slowdown, for example, in recruitment and an increase as well in layoffs. What is really pertinent is the question that we had on workload. And I brought in the specific graph on academic staff, but we have a similar one on administrative staff. But you see that across the different regions of the world, and most importantly in the Americas, academic staff is reporting an increase in workload. So I think that this is important to recognize, because I think it's also a testimony to the fact that higher education institutions across the world have really done extraordinary efforts in order to ensure that higher education was not disrupted at a time where we could not meet in presence and we had to shift to remote operations. This is, of course, feasible on the short term, but it's something that has to be carefully monitored moving forward, because it's not necessarily sustainable to continue in the same manner over time. So yet another thing which is important to look into. Now, shifting to teaching and learning, I think that it was rather positive that we see in this second global survey that 89% of the institutions are offering remote teaching and learning. This is clearly an increase compared to the first report that we did at the outset of the pandemic, where particularly institutions in Africa were having difficulties transition to remote teaching and learning. So I think that 1 year into the pandemic, we have seen progress. But there is, of course, still a diversity among regions. Europe, it's higher, and Africa lower, as you see here. And when we then ask those 89% of the institutions to what extent that they are able to reach out to their student body, the overall average that we see is 86% of the students. But again, here, when we break it down by region, this outreach is higher in Europe, where we have up to 92%, and it's the lowest in Africa, where it's 3/4 of the students that the institutions are able to reach out to. Digging a bit deeper into this, we also looked at how many of the institutions are actually able to reach out to their full student body, so 100% of their students. And that is the case for almost 40% in Europe, but only 14% in Africa. So when we look at the details, it becomes even further divided in terms of the opportunities of students to actually have access to the learning offer. In the same manner, when we look at how many institutions are reaching out to less than 50% of their overall student body, this only concerns 2% in Europe, but it concerns almost a quarter in Africa. So I think that at the same time, we see progress and we see that a high number of institutions are offering remote teaching and learning, but we also see that with the pandemic, we are in a situation where many students are at risk, and in certain regions of the world, this risk is much higher, and it more or less correlates with those regions that already have a lower student population proportionally within the region compared to other regions. So again, positive, but at the same time with some voice of concern moving forward. We had a question on the increase of digital tools as we have all become more reliant on digital tools in order to continue operations during the pandemic. And here you see, I only included the number of those who expressed increase because across the world, across the regions, it is of course very high. There has been an important change. Up at the top, you see online learning, and then at the end, you see learning analytics. And I just wanted to reflect on that because I think that, of course, in this area, we are seeing an expansion of online learning, but maybe an expansion that will not stay to the same extent moving forward. Whereas I think that we are reinforcing digital infrastructures in higher education, and which may lead to an increasing use of learning analytics moving forward. So I think that over time, we may see even a further increase of that one. In terms of the impact of teaching and learning on the curriculum, we also wanted to see how the different disciplines were impacted. So we asked the universities to indicate whether the curriculum of a specific discipline can be offered, can be taught from distance, or whether it's heavily impacted by the fact that it has to be taught from distance. And of course, again, not all universities offer all disciplines. So here we are comparing those who are concerned by the different disciplines. But I think that this table shows very nicely that for some disciplines, such as the humanities, business and administration, law, social and behavioral sciences, universities are indicating that these can be taught from distance without too much of an impact on curriculum. However, on the other side of the scale, for disciplines such as health and welfare, agriculture, physical sciences, engineering, manufacturing, construction, life sciences, more institutions are saying that the curriculum is heavily impacted by the pandemic and by the fact that we are operating remotely in many countries. The last slide that I have on the global survey is again a follow-up looking at the impact on the curriculum. We asked institutions to what extent that the curriculum were impacted, and 7% said yes, it was impacted. 36% said yes, some of the program or courses were impacted. 37% said not necessarily, the curriculum was not necessarily impacted, but that there were consequences in terms of the delivery or implementation. And then 20% of the institutions were saying, no, there is no impact on the curriculum. So for the 80% that were expressing some degree of impact, we asked them how this impact came into to place. And here you see, and I will focus on the three top categories coming out of this question. We see that 51% of the institutions are saying that curricula have a more theoretical than practical focus because of restrictions due to COVID-19. And the second one, our curricula became more practical in the sense of using case studies, problem-based learning in an effort of trying to engage the students from distance. And one can maybe almost say that those two are contradictory, but the way that we see it is in relation to the table that we just saw before on the different disciplines, that disciplines where you normally need access to laboratories, where you need access to specific material, those types of disciplines have turned more theoretical during the pandemic because of the restrictions in place, whereas other disciplines such as the humanities, business and administration, well, for those disciplines that can more easily be taught from distance, there's been a tendency to turn to more practical curriculum and use of case studies. The third one and the last one that I want to mention here is as well that our curricula is more flexible. Students have more freedom in choosing their learning path. And that one I wanted to highlight because I think that it is important to keep in mind as well when we assess the lessons learned during the pandemic and how we wish to construct the future moving forward. So these were a few insights into the findings of our survey, and we have so many other important and interesting data, but we are limited of time here. So I want to go to the second part, where I want to just share very quickly a few thoughts about how this will impact the future of higher education. And I very explicitly chose this picture with some very heavy gray clouds, but also some silver linings. So let me first turn to some of the challenges, and then I will end my presentation with some of the more positive opportunities that I think we can build on. So when we look at the clouds or the challenges, I think that we are seeing in our data of our survey that the pandemic is definitely exacerbating inequalities. So this is of true concern and an issue that we need to address in order to build bridges in a world of inequalities. We do see progress in terms of digital infrastructures in many developing countries, but at the same time, progress is also happening elsewhere. So somehow we continue to have a gap. And this gap is really important to address, because I think that more and more information and access to information is available online. So like education, I think that online access should become a human right. So it must be addressed as a global issue in order to find global solutions for the way forward. The other important cloud or challenge I think that we have before us is the ethical dimension of digital data, because the fact that we have turned towards more use of digital tools, of course, also means that there is an exponential increase in digital data. And I think that this is really an important area of priority for higher education moving forward, that we do also have debate and discussions around data governance so that we create higher education with fair, ethical, and transparent use of digital data. And I think that higher education institutions almost have a dual responsibility at the same time, of course, of thinking about how higher education institutions are using data, but also in the sense that how we educate students and how we discuss digital data and the digital footprints that students are leaving as well when they navigate online. So we have to acknowledge, of course, that there is no one solution fits all, but I think that what we try to do, at least at the IAU, is to connect people from around the world to create a forum where we can discuss and exchange experiences, propose different solutions for inspiration, and to, of course, also discuss what are the challenges ahead. So those for me are two very important clouds that we need to address. But let's have a look at some of the silver linings as well. And I think that one of them are what I call the mainstreaming effect of the pandemic. I see it a bit as a new starting point. Before the pandemic at the IAU, we did actually a global survey as well on the state of digital transformation around the world. And that report was launched in January 2020, just a few months before the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that today this is not bad in the sense that it is an important baseline of the situation in higher education prior to the pandemic. And at that point in time, we very often reach out or engaged with some hubs within universities or that are interested in digital transformation. I think that the perspective has really shifted now, because it's not for a specific group of experts. Digital transformation is really cross-cutting across the university. All sectors or functions of the university have been hit, and we are all reliant on digital transformation during this time of pandemic. And this means that there is an opportunity to engage in more inclusive digital transformation, but it does require that it is a priority to consult and to distill lessons learned, because during the pandemic, we are maybe forced to use digital technologies more than we would actually like to. So we have to prepare, I hope, for a world where digital technologies are used by choice and not by force. And for that, we need a vision in order to see where we are aiming at, where we want to go. And we also need flexibility, because as we saw in many of the slides as well, it has different impact in terms of different disciplines. So it has to be a rather flexible, but I hope inclusive digital transformation. We also have to accept that higher education is responding to different needs of different learners. So that leads me to say as well that I do not believe that the future is exclusively online or exclusively face-to-face. This is not new, but in certain for us, we do hear some kind of a conversation of, is the quality of online learning high enough? And I think that it is fair enough, but I see online and face-to-face learning as different modes of learning, and there can be quality in online learning as there can be quality in face-to-face learning. It's really a matter of setting it up and preparing it according to the different modes of learning, of course. And the biggest challenge during the pandemic was as well that faculty and teaching staff was not necessarily prepared and had to shift in a very short time frame. So I think that moving forward and thinking forward, I think that the future is blended. We need at the same time face-to-face education. I think that when we look at different segments of learners here on the slide, I just highlighted, for example, young students versus lifelong learners. And I think that's particularly for the group of young students, the social space of a university is of utmost importance, that you can come together, you would develop, you exchange with other students. And this is a very important social function of universities that is not necessarily quantified in the finances in the same way as the student enrollment numbers, as the degrees or diplomas awarded by the institution. So I think that it is really important when we move forward and think about universities of the future, that we also recognize that universities are much more than the credentials that they offer. They are also social institutions that are essential to society. But we also need space for lifelong learners and learners with other needs, where online education provides another type of flexibility that allows for self-paced learning in a different way. So I think that it is really important to see the different modes of learning, not as in competition with one or the other in the sense that one is going to replace the other, but more as complementary and responding to different needs of different learners. And then the final one that I will highlight here, and I will end my presentation with that, is that I also see this era as an opportunity for more inclusive collaboration. We did not look at the findings on research in our global survey, but from respondents in Africa and in the Americas, we actually saw some saying that there is an increased quality in international research collaboration as well. And I think that it's because the fact that we can meet online and that we can engage is for some bringing down some of the barriers that were before the pandemic in terms of having access to financing, to attend conferences, to have get the visa in order to enter the different countries. So I think that even though I do not hope that everything will take place online, and I hope that we will be able to attend conferences as well in person, I think that there is an opportunity if we make use of it for a more inclusive collaboration moving forward. And if we really use this momentum, I think there is also an opportunity for democratizing knowledge. And at the moment, IAU is based at UNESCO, and at the moment, UNESCO is holding their general conference. And one of the normative instruments that they are approving during this general conference is on open science. So 196 member states are committed to this new normative instrument of open science. And I think this is very important for teaching and learning as well, because if this is something that we really want to pursue, then it has to be instilled in the values of students and during their teaching and learning as well. So I think that this is an opportunity to really use collective intelligence to address the global challenges, and of course, taking into consideration the local context in the different countries around the world. So those were a few thoughts on my end, and I look forward to continuing the conversation later. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Trini. Muy interesante tu presentación. Nos pone también en un contexto de enseñanza virtual, online, de emergencia que hemos estado, así que nos permite para la ronda de preguntas poder tener muchos temas sobre los cuales discutir. Muy clara, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Bien, junto con agradecer a Trine, vamos a continuar con la ponencia del doctor Dan Rementi, que nos presenta el tema La Universidad del Futuro. El doctor Dan Rementi se especializa en metodología de la investigación. Fue durante más de una década profesor invitado en gestión de sistemas de información en la Escuela de Estudios de Sistemas y Datos de Trinity College de la Universidad de Dublín. Enseña metodología de investigación y sociología de la investigación, además de supervisar investigadores académicos y trabajar como académico en the University of the Western Cape en Sudáfrica y director de Academic Conference and Publishing International. Damos la cordial bienvenida a Dan. Así que si puedes conectarte, Dan, prender tu cámara. Ahí está, perfecto. Bien, Dan, te damos la cordial bienvenida y puedes comenzar.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm really so tempted to say good afternoon, but I guess it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be. I'm going to switch on to try to share the screen. I have a few slides I'd like to show you as we go. So I became interested in the University of the Future a couple of years ago. But I didn't have the connections or the resources to do the type of survey you've just heard about. But I am involved with a organization that has a mailing list of 40,000 research active academics. And so we emailed them and told them we were going to publish a book called The University of the Future. My apologies, I just have to find some way of just killing this. So we emailed them, and we said, we're going to have this book. Would you like to write a chapter? So we had about 70 responses of people who wanted to write chapters, and then we wanted it to be an academic publication, so they had to be reviewed and went through all of that procedure. So at the end of the day, a book was published a year later, nearly a year later, with 22 papers on the University of the Future. And it came out one month before the COVID crisis, the COVID crisis really struck. The book was quite good, quite comprehensive, but it didn't have the word COVID in it. So we then had launched a second book called Responding to the COVID Crisis. And we had an express publishing track on that, and about 6 months later, and we had another book with another 20 papers now focused on COVID. So that's the background to my comments, is that we had two publishing activities on the University of the Future. Altogether, there were 40-something chapters by academics from all over the world. The book expresses a fair amount of criticism about universities. And in fact, I should really contextualize that by saying that one of the reasons that triggered my interest in the University of the Future was that I became aware of just about all media in my environment being negative about universities. They were negative about the fees, they were negative about the teaching, they were negative about the exams, they were negative about the salaries which the high office bearers were taking out of the university. It really did seem that the universities had, and I know this is an extraordinary generalization, because of course there are some superb universities that have done a wonderful job, but other universities have more or less become big businesses. They become multi-function, multi-process, multinational, whatever you want to say, organizations, where the concept of studenthood has been largely abandoned, and where they have become, students have become clients. Of all the wrong steps the universities have taken in my lifetime, I first attended university somewhat more than 50 years ago. The reclassification of students as clients was probably the biggest error that was ever made along the way. So it's not by any means clear to me or to the people that I have been in correspondence with and have been working on these books with, that the universities are responding well to the environment which they find themselves. One of the things that became more clear to me during this exercise is that universities have been for a long time and should always be a reflection of the society in which they serve. And of course, the society in which we serve, as was brilliantly pointed out by our first speaker, is enormously complex. And I guess that's one of the reasons why universities themselves can be so complex. Anyway, moving ahead, I put together a number of pictures. The first picture here on the left-hand side is the university where I got my first degree. It is in Durban. And for many years, I thought that building was original until I went to the University of Pittsburgh, where I ran some seminars some years ago, and there it is, the university. Can you plagiarize a building? I wonder. I'm not absolutely sure. This is a photograph of where I obtained my doctorate. It's called Henley Management College. It is one of the most idyllic sites in the United Kingdom, on the banks of the river, on the bank of the River Thames. It is now part of Reading University. Really, one of the interesting things about this place is that for two separate occasions, one in the 50s and one in the 70s, it was regarded as probably the most important business school in the world. In the 50s, it was the first institution to pioneer mid-career management education. And it was so successful that it had for a very significant amount of time, over 10 years, a waiting list to get in. The waiting list was 2 years. You had to put your name down 2 years ahead to get into it. There are not many universities who can claim that they've ever had that type of experience. Again, in the 70s, they were the first interdistance learning MBAs. And at one time, they had 7,000 active MBA students at a time when that number was just off the radar for most people. This is a university where I had my first professorship, and the reason I'm showing you this is because it's in Johannesburg, and it's a very non-prestigious university in the sense that it really does focus on delivering a high degree of utility, and yet it couldn't resist the temptation of putting in the Grecian columns and the Grecian triangle. I firmly believe that too much energy is put into showing off our ancient connections rather than concentrating on what the society needs today and what we can do about our future. It was mentioned in my introduction that I spent some time at Trinity College in Dublin. This is the fabulously beautiful site. This is the front door, and again, they couldn't get away from the Grecian facade. Interesting thing about it is that even today, Trinity College graduate their students in Latin. So when the graduation ceremony starts, you can just switch off because you're not going to understand any words from that point onwards. I think it's a tragedy that universities want to look backwards so much, especially to want to conduct any of their ceremonies in Latin. And then finally, I noticed that I have been put down as being in Cape Town. Well, I am an extraordinary professor at the, I guess one might say, the second university in Cape Town. This is the first one where I got my MBA from. And I have an extraordinary professorship at the University of the Western Cape, which is about 10 miles away. The University of the Western Cape, it even has columns and triangles. We can't seem to get away from it. Why do we want to go to university? What are universities good for? Well, there are so many ways of answering that question. In reality, we go to university for a very large number of different reasons. And I have made a list of them further down the line here in one of my slides, but it is as much to do with social reasons as to do with accreditation, to do with acquiring knowledge, etc., etc. It is very, very complex. It is also to do with preparing ourselves for the world of work. One of my pet hates at the moment is that people come to me and they say, we are being criticized because the university is being criticized because we're not making our students work ready. I have no idea what work ready could actually mean in practice. I'm prepared to go along with the notion of career savvy, make people know about the world of work, make people know about what is going to be expected of them, make people know about how they can get the most from these situations. I think that is really one of the important aspects of university life, which is not often emphasized. We are still looking back. Here is where we came from. And of course, that's a very Eurocentric view. And there are lots of people who say, hang on for a minute, there were universities all over the world long before Bologna. I have a small degree of sympathy with that view, but the type of institutions we develop today can be seen as being rooted in what happened in Bologna, and being seen to have picked up some of the ideas of pedagogy from the ancient Greeks and developed it further, etc. But at the end of the day, what is very often omitted is that the modern university really does owe its roots to the University of Berlin at the beginning of the 19th century, where the whole idea of research was properly formulated within the university concept, and that's where we've gone from now. The bottom of the slide, I said they are complex, multifunctional, multi-product, multinational entities with clients rather than students, and some extremely overpaid high office bearers. I'm not quite sure how many universities are still using the term high office bearer. That was the way that the Senate of the University of Witwatersrand, where I had my first chair, they always talked about the vice chancellor and I mean, there was a whole load of different deputy vice chancellors. I think many universities today have abandoned that and have now just talked about executives. So here is the second book that we produced. So the media were really critical of all of these different issues here. I was really interested in the comment about the United Nations initiative of the I can't remember what was the expression again, the International Association of Universities talking about 20,000 different universities. I hear numbers range from 10,000 to 40,000 different universities. I guess it really does depend on your definition of the word. And some of the institutions that claim to be universities are really quite in the tails of the normal distribution. They're far from the mean of what one might mean by a university. So this is the description of the different emphasis universities can have. They can be to do with delivering education. They can be to do with creating knowledge. They can be to do with stimulating the economy. They can be to do with earning better salaries, major employers. They can be a focus on the alumni. They can be a place to grow up. Certainly in my time, my undergraduate days, they were really quite reckless in comparison to what happens today. And all I can say is that, over the last 50 odd years, perhaps our society has matured a significant amount. A place to meet a partner is even one of the reasons that was given for why one should go to university. I've listed here the major activities involved in the processes of producing a university education, to do with registration, to do with delivery, to do with examinations, etc., etc. All of these are highly important, and when you look around the world, you will find examples of where universities have got these wrong. University acquisition and registration, acquisition of students. We had a big scandal in the US a couple of years ago where I understand some people actually went to prison for bribing universities to allow their children in. Was it the parents who went to jail, or was it the universities who went to jail? Or I can't remember the details anymore. But there are problems the whole way through. Examinations are bothering people immensely, especially examinations that are held online. There's an awful lot of worry about how authentic such a process of testing could be. I am a great fan of Chomsky, and he has a video on YouTube, and I had a connection to this, and I intended playing it. Unfortunately, it got lost in the electronic transfer from one system to another. And John B. asked the questions of what is a university education about? What is a sign of being educated? And he comes up with a very, very simple answer to that. And he says, it's being able to ask really good questions. That is the first and foremost indication that you've been through an educational process. You've been able to formulate in your own mind what the incompleteness of anything that are said. Now, we heard this morning about the post-truth world. I have some worries about that, because although I completely recognize we are in a post-truth world, I suspect that we've never been in anything else but a post-truth world. The difference today is that it has become much more obvious, because there are far more articulate people around, and there's far greater ability for people with different views to reach the general public. I am not sure whether the dreadful politicians we see around the world today, who lie through their teeth all the time, lie all that much more than they did before, except before they were much smarter at covering it up. I worry about that. I suspect that we have not really deteriorated as much as we're often suggested that we have. Now, what is the point of all of this exercise of university anyway? So we have this old Chinese proverbs, and I am told by sources that I think are at least semi-reliable that many of the so-called Chinese proverbs have got nothing to do with China, but who cares? They are words of wisdom of some sort. It says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Well, there has to be some sense in that, other than it should certainly not use the word man anymore. I'm much more comfortable with the word person. Karl Marx comes along and says, sell a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man how to fish, and you ruin a wonderful business opportunity. Now, of course, Karl Marx never said that, but it's an interpretation of the idea of what, and I really hesitate to use the word communism because there's such an abused word, but as a more social attitude towards our society is. And is one which I entirely disagree with, I might add. But this man says something that is interesting, and I have no idea who he is other than a face on the internet, Nick Offerman. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Don't teach a man to fish and you feed yourself. He's a grown man. Fishing is not that hard. One of the things I think is wrong with our university system is that we actually communicate far too much detail. We try to teach people far too much of things that are not necessarily, it's not that they're not important, but they're not necessarily essential. What we really want to do at a university is we want to do two really important things. The first one is we want to show the importance of knowledge. And secondly, we want to instill in our students a love for the acquisition of knowledge. And that brings me back to this lifelong learning, is that the whole idea of a degree being 3 years, 4 years, or whatever it is complete nonsense. It's a completely artificial cutoff. What we want to say is that in order to live as complete, as full, as enjoyable a life as possible, you have to get on a track of continuous self-improvement. I know that that word is loaded with all sorts of other philosophical nuances that could take us the rest of the day to discuss. But it really isn't about, can I get enough knowledge to pass that exam paper? And unfortunately, that is the way that it is done. So here I've put down a whole load of other pieces. These slides are all available to you if you want them, about the inherent difficulties in the delivery. See, one of the other issues is a lecture is one of the most dreadful ways of communicating information. And there has been a suggestion that no one remembers more than, I don't know, pick a percentage, 20% of what they hear in the lecture. It has been suggested that nobody can retain concentration for more than, pick a number, so many minutes. When I've started teaching online over a year ago with the pandemic, I spent as much time as I could watching videos from different institutions, and I watched several from Harvard saying that a presentation, an online presentation, should never exceed, the first lot I watched said 10 minutes, the second lot I watched said 7 minutes. Now, I've already spoken now for about 20 minutes, I think. They said, this is no good. You've got to change the media. You've got to change the subject. You've got to change whatever it is. The whole business of communication through a flow of verbiage for any period of time is highly questionable. The very best way of educating anybody has got to be through the dialectic. The dialectic is a fundamental tool of improving the mind. Now, I mean, the dialectic is so simple. Not everybody, unfortunately, is aware of the term, but the dialectic is stretching back to Socrates, right? Says the way to understand is through putting ideas further forth, thinking about them, seeing what their limitations or how they could be improved, reformulating the idea, putting it forward again, having another discussion about it, and so we go around the loop. And that is the method by which the best form of education that we know of at the moment can be delivered. I put down other comments here about the examination system needs to be overhauled. The whole concept of research has become highly problematic. There is no doubt that research is extremely important, and there is no doubt that all students should be made acquainted with all the ins and outs of research. They should know about methodology, they should know about research practice, they should know about how to interpret results, etc., etc. But it should not be the be-all and end-all of academia. And this is what has become so much so today. If you don't have, if you're not researching and publishing in appropriate journals, you are in a very career disadvantaged position. Outreach of community, collaboration with greater society, all of this is really, really very, very important. But I'm not going to go into it today. What needs to happen? A distinctive change in mindset. University's reputation is built on the faculty, so the faculty needs to be more encouraged and helped than they are today. Often faculty have little or no role in determining the university strategy. Get the faculty involved in the management of the institution. Continuous improvement and continuous reevaluation of the vision and the mission of the university, so that it doesn't dig itself further into the idea of being a big corporate event with clients. Questions to ask: what is the point of higher education? What are the educational requirements of society? Who could or should determine this? How should it be funded? I really believe that education should be as inexpensive as possible. Obviously, it consumes resources, and resources have got to be paid for in some sort of way. I'm not going to be naive about that, but I think the type of fees that are often asked in some parts of the world are just really silly. I actually don't really want to go through any more of these. I think I've spoken for long enough. I've got a feeling that we are behind the time, and I'd rather leave any further comments that I could make to question time. So may I hand this back over to you?
Muchas gracias, Dan, por tu presentación. Seguramente van a haber muchas inquietudes en la ronda de preguntas. Entonces,
I hope so.
entonces, en honor al tiempo, primero quiero recordarles hacer todas sus preguntas en la sección preguntas y respuestas que está en la barra inferior de Zoom para que tengamos bastante que comentar al final de la sesión. Bien, entonces ahora le doy nuevamente las gracias a Dan y finalmente vamos a la presentación de la doctora Roberta M. Bassett, que presenta la temática Invertir en resiliencia y equidad en educación secundaria para reconstruir mejor. Roberta es líder mundial de educación terciaria del Banco Mundial, donde dirige los esfuerzos de reforma que abordan cuestiones como la equidad, la inclusión, finanzas, gobernanza y garantía de calidad, internacionalización de conocimientos, investigación, innovación, competitividad, habilidades y resultados, y la enseñanza y aprendizaje a distancia. Antes de unirse al Banco Mundial 12 años atrás, se desempeñó funciones como profesora de política y gestión de la educación superior en la Universidad de Southampton, en Reino Unido, y vicedecana de estudios continuos y sesión de verano de la Universidad de Stanford. Te agradezco, Roberta, por estar acá y te doy el pase a la presentación.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Veronica, for this invitation to present today and to represent the World Bank at this great event. So I also have slides. I will share my screen. And I naturally talk very quickly anyway, but I will talk extra quickly in order to allow time for the question and answer. So Veronica, if you can just let me know if you can see my screen. I'm going to assume yes.
Sí, se ve perfecto.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the context in which the World Bank works in tertiary education, what we use as sort of our thought frameworks around the efforts that we do in tertiary education. And then I will introduce a new framework that we developed during the COVID pandemic era. Like many of the presenters before me, we had done a lot of work about sort of steering our client countries to think more about how to reform effectively. And then the pandemic hit, and we really had to rethink what we were advising, what we thought the future was going to look like for them in the face of these transformative changes. And so this is the outcome of sort of the rejiggering of that effort that was almost done, as with many of the presenters already. In around January, we had presented it to the management of the World Bank in January 2020, and then of course spent the last year and a half redoing it to make sure it would still be relevant in the post-pandemic era. So hopefully this is going to move. Let me see. Here we go. Okay, so first we talk about tertiary education, and unlike the presenters before us, we aren't focused on universities explicitly. We focus on all types of formal education that follows the completion of upper secondary. And so that is universities, of course, from the most prestigious research universities, but it also includes post-secondary non-university institutions like community colleges, like post-secondary TVET, micro-credential delivery, short course delivery, anything that happens in a formal setting that leads to some form of credential in the post-secondary space. That's what we talk about when we talk about tertiary education. So why do we support investing in tertiary education? We do it for several reasons. One is because we know tertiary education fosters long-term growth and boosts shared prosperity. And this is true in every country on the planet. It isn't just the wealthiest countries that benefit from tertiary education. We know that workers with tertiary education cope better with economic shocks. They're more employable and they earn higher wages. They also have the highest return on investments in tertiary education. And this is seen through decades of research, and most recently, the research that has come out of the World Bank actually has shown that these return on investments, both social and private, are highest in the lowest income countries. And this has to do with supply and demand, obviously, but it shows that there are really big investment benefits to investing in tertiary education. And then finally, the wider societal individual benefits. Lots of studies showing that individuals and society experience benefits that are not monetary, that include higher civic participation, better health outcomes, etc. So collectively, this is the environment in which we look and say, this is a worthwhile investment for every country. So we encourage our clients to do so. Sorry. And again, back to the rate of return, this is just an economic assessment, what happens for every dollar that's invested in education. In terms of tertiary education, we have seen steady since the 80s benefits to tertiary education, and it mirrors a bit the growth in enrollment patterns right up until 2000, when tertiary education enrollments globally have skyrocketed. And you'll see here as well, more people than ever are accessing tertiary education, and tertiary education enrollments globally doubled between 2000 and 2013, and since 2013 have grown another 22%. And so we will expect to see a plateauing. You saw that in Trina's presentation as well from the university perspective. There's been some perhaps stabilization around enrollments. We may not see the same rapid growth in enrollments, at least in the immediate period of the COVID pandemic, but there isn't any great expectation from what we're seeing globally that this is going to be a decrease or even a steady plateau. We expect the growth to continue, maybe just not at the same rapid rates that was the case in the last decade, in the last 20 years especially. But here you can see that there's great disparity globally around the gross enrollment ratios into tertiary education, where you can see in North America, it's over 80% of the expected cohort is enrolling in tertiary education. As you work your way through the regions of the world, you see great differentiations. And this is something the World Bank is really aware of and work towards focusing our reform initiatives on, where we see the gaps forming in the lowest income regions here. Sub-Saharan Africa is only enrolling about 9% of their cohort versus North America's 80%. And as the global knowledge economy becomes the driving economy of the world, you see these regions falling further behind. These are the gaps that we're working hard to close, utilizing reforms and improvements in tertiary education. As I just noted, this is an additional representation of the gaps in enrollment patterns, but here you can really see Sub-Saharan Africa, which has had an incredible amount of growth, doubling their enrollments in tertiary education every 20 years since 1978. It's just not been enough because of how much has happened in the wealthier spaces globally. And this is the work that we focus our energies on, especially at the bank. And here, again, this is a global disparity that I just discussed region to region. You can also see it within countries. You can see that in each country, and this is not wealthy country, poor country, really, it's really about upper quintiles and lower quintiles of the population in any country. You can see disparities in enrollment patterns. So what we just saw globally, you see locally, such as in France, where of the wealthiest quintile, about 65% would be expected to enroll in tertiary education. The poorest quintile is only around 30%. And then in a country like Senegal, of the wealthiest quintile, 8% is enrolling in tertiary, but 0% in the lowest quintile. So these gaps are significant and they're expanding, and there are equity considerations for this at the local level as well as at the global level. So within this context, the World Bank has supported tertiary education investments since 1963, and at that time it was largely about pre-service teacher training. But as you can see on the right-hand side of my slide, that we do invest in large, diverse areas of tertiary education, including public sector development. We're focusing a lot on competitiveness and innovation from research outcomes. Skills and employability is an expanding area for us. Higher education systems, the whole system assessment, but you'll still see here the biggest amount of efforts that we put in are around teaching and learning and student outcomes. Just some key facts to situate the environment that I'm describing. Since 2015, the World Bank has supported about 276 tertiary education initiatives, and the lending amount is just over $9 billion in this period. Globally, we see the largest number of projects are happening in the Africa region, followed by Europe and Central Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean after that. I am situated in the education global practice. We do lead most of the tertiary education work, but there are tertiary education projects that take place in the agricultural practice, for instance, social development as well, depending on the institutions that are being supported or the policy that's being reformed. And then I already talked about the investment portfolio. So here's the regional distribution, just more distinctly separated around the globe. You can see 75% of our projects are in lower and upper middle income countries. The world sees tertiary education as a high income country issue. We actually support tertiary education enrollment reform initiatives in every region, regardless of income level of the countries. And the work that we do is country driven. So the country would approach the bank and ask for support for higher education and tertiary education reforms, then we come in and support the project design and the reform initiative in partnership with the country. And so it doesn't really matter to us which country client comes forward and asks for this assistance. We provide it and do some analytical work to support effective reform initiatives on the ground for our clients. So here again is the representation of the investment portfolio, Africa being the largest beneficiary or the largest recipient of World Bank projects for tertiary education. And within all of that, so this question of global knowledge economy, these drivers, higher education, tertiary education, supporting both skills and outcomes, but also health and well-being. The World Bank has been looking at how we can support our clients to reform their sectors, and we developed this steering framework, and it is a 5-point pillared framework, with the first point being strategically diversified systems. So as I said before, we are not specifically focused on universities. We are interested very much in the multitude and diversity of mission types that institutions can have across any country that allows for students to find the right place for themselves in the education post-secondary space. So if they want a short course, if they're looking for something very specific for professional outcome, or if they're looking for a theoretically driven, research-driven, world-class university experience, all of those could exist and support each other and feed into a healthy, diversified system. And that's something to be considered in as many countries as possible, especially as expanding enrollments is a growing consideration. Technology, something that we're all talking about. We've spent a lot of time already today talking about this. It's not something that is the future. It's something that's very much today. And in many ways, technology has been something that has allowed for continued delivery of higher education, but it has also been something that has exposed an expanded equity challenge in remote learning and blended learning, where the digital divide has left a lot of students behind when they couldn't access their studies remotely during the pandemic. All of these questions about the benefits and the challenges of technology, that's something every country needs to be aware of and invest in utilizing technology in the best way possible for the benefit of their institutions and their students. The next point is equity. As I just noted, we saw a lot of equity challenges, not just caused by technology, obviously, but also caused by all of the impacts of the pandemic. And we see them globally and we're seeing them locally. And I have a slide that will go into those details in a second. The next point is efficiency. And here we're not talking just about financial efficiencies. We're talking about organizational and structural efficiencies. Do you have quality assurance regimes that are fit for purpose and that are agile enough to embrace the new delivery modalities in higher education and tertiary education? Do you have the talent you need? Are they being trained in a way that is letting them utilize all of these new innovations? Do you have effective financing, perhaps performance-based financing? And is all of that supported through a data-driven system? I'll talk about that a little bit in a second as well, but these are all sort of the foundational elements of an efficient system, and that's the point we make here with this this E in steer. And then the last issue is about resilience, and this is something we hadn't really thought much about prior to the pandemic, but of course it's something all of us are thinking about as we look at our systems and say, you know, are they going to be able to continue delivering towards their mission and towards the outcomes that they're designed to support in a system that still is being racked a bit by instability? And so we discussed that a bit as well in this framework. So just to dig into them just a little bit more, we talk about, as I mentioned already, the multitude of institutional types, universities, polytechnics, post-secondary TVET, short-term courses. All of these you see extensively expanding globally, but we're not just interested in the multitude of missions and institutions, we're interested also in the pathways, and that any student can enter at some point and with the talent and the drive and the capacity come back as a lifelong learner. So you do enter at one point, you get your first degree or your first credential, you work for a little while, there's a way to come back, there's a way to keep upskilling and relearning and doing all the things that the modern world of work requires, and that the system should be in place that allows for that to happen. Oops, sorry. The next one is technology, and I did discuss this a bit already, that there are some real benefits to technology if used wisely and thoughtfully, improving access and options through online and blended delivery. As we know, this has been one of the great revelations of the pandemic era, but also issues like relevance, where you couldn't do hands-on learning in place, you could do learning through virtual reality or artificial intelligence. There are ways maybe that technology can allow for expanded delivery of what was once very practical and hands-on to greater audiences that may be further removed from the in-class experience. It's not ideal. We heard the other speakers saying this as well. Of course, we know that students need socialization and in-class learning, but how does technology really supplement that or complement that when needed? And then this last point, again, this idea of pathways can be supported through issues like stacked credentials. Blockchain is providing a way to manage that process, etc. Technology is really serving a key purpose there. And as I noted before, in terms of efficiencies, technology is allowing greater understanding of student outcomes through tracer studies, learning science, etc. So we do know that technology is underpinning some really important developments and stability in the tertiary education sector. Here I talk a bit about the equity issues, and I have a few more slides because I was asked and because it's a big issue for me personally and professionally. The equity considerations of tertiary education expansion and expanded access. We look at issues like this, issues of fairness, relevance, diversity, and flexibility. What do students access and how do they get there? Do they have multiple opportunities to seek out the studies that they're most interested in? Are they funneled or channeled in ways that don't recognize their talents, but just are based on sort of historic norms of what women study or what students of lower income groups get channeled towards? How much is their flexibility and accessibility built into the admission structure and the progression support for any student going through a tertiary education experience. Then here I looked a lot at what we saw as the international disparities that were emerging and became more readily apparent during the COVID pandemic. And I structured them in this way because this is how we really saw some of the country-to-country comparators, the countries that had stronger infrastructure, where electricity was more stable, the broadband networks were deeply developed and also inexpensive. Those were able to have a much more robust response to the pandemic and are coming through and out of the pandemic much more quickly. We saw in spaces with academic agility where the quality assurance regimes were able to take on either cross-border online delivery or adaptation on the ground at the institutional level, where countries could manage that and had a space for that, could train their academic staff quickly. They too became much more adept at delivering and continuing their educational mission during the pandemic. We saw countries with stronger political and governance stability were able to just recognize the challenges more quickly, direct financing towards those challenges, and again, support the sector in continual delivery. And then this last point, countries with stronger economic development tended to have the technological space already in place to start doing these interventions very quickly. Technology is extremely expensive, and countries that just didn't have the financial flexibility to invest rapidly in these technological interventions fell behind as well. And then here you can see those actually also happened on a very micro level in a country-to-country space. Wealthier institutions were able to adapt more quickly. Poorer institutions that dealt a lot with more lower income students had a much harder time adapting. They lost a lot more students. The dropout rates were very high at those institutions, community colleges, post-secondary TVET institutions, and those students in many countries have yet to return to their studies, and that's something that we'll be monitoring for the next few years to see what sort of interventions are needed to get them back in the classroom. You saw this on a community level as well, where there are infrastructure differences as students left their urban environments or their campus environments and went home to spaces where internet penetration may have been non-existent. We know in many regions, the internet penetration in many countries is less than 30, less than 40%, and most of that internet penetration is in the urban centers. So as soon as they left the urban centers, students were left behind, and that was a big community-to-community challenge during the pandemic and is ongoing still. You found too with, students went to their homes and their families very often the students returned to spaces that weren't private enough for effective studies. They didn't have a dedicated space that wasn't conducive to their learning. And so just the localized challenges for an individual student, very difficult when they went back to their home families. And then this last point, which is that they often also returned to lives that required them to be working. And maybe they had jobs on their campuses, they had built a life around their campus. Once they went back to their home environment, or wherever they went when their campuses closed, they had responsibilities that often took them away from their studies. And again, those are the students who are worried won't return to tertiary education. So those are the big equity challenges that we're encouraging our countries to think about and to plan and work around responding to very quickly. All of that is underpinned by stable foundations that are efficient in their delivery. And here we have a visual that represents what we see as the strength of a strong sector, which starts with a vision. And I've heard other speakers talk about this today. What is the national strategy? What are the outcome goals? What is the vision for your national system for tertiary education? And underpinning that is good data, a tertiary education management information system that focuses on understanding genuinely what's happening on the ground in that country. Do you have the data you need to make effective policies that can respond to the challenges and lead to positive outcomes? And within all this focus on steering the system through a strong regulatory framework with effective governance, and on the other side, enabling the outcomes that you want, that are equitable, that are focused on retention and successful completion of relevant studies. And in the middle, as I said before, effective financing, robust and agile quality assurance, and an investment, a genuine investment in the talent that is required to lead and teach in these systems. And then finally, focusing on resilience. And as I noted earlier, this was the area that was even new to us, because we really hadn't thought a whole lot about a global sense of needing institutions or systems to be planning for resilience. But of course, that is what all of us are doing now as we support our sectors. And here we looked at two explicit definitions for resilience. One was the capacity of an enterprise to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of turbulent change. But the second was about the system. It's the capacity of a system to experience shocks while retaining essentially the same function, structure, feedback, and therefore identity. And as we all know, higher education, tertiary education is very mission driven. It's very identity driven. All of this about resilience is about supporting a sector that can keep doing what it does best, learn from what it hasn't done well, and become better and better for the students and its stakeholders in the future. Here we focus lastly, just sort of what are the implementation considerations of resilience? One, conscientious planning, being mindful and regularly evaluating the agility in the delivery of quality and highly relevant programs. Adaptive governance allows for strategies to be put in place to exist in an uncertain world and tackle that uncertainty through planning ahead and thinking about what you know about uncertainty and what you know worked during times of shocks. And that's what we're learning today. Institutional diversity, as I noted already earlier, allows for teaching institutions, research institutions, practical professional institutions to all exist and to serve the needs of their students. And some of them may be more resilient in certain shocks than others, but the diversity of those institutions allows the system to have some stability in times of disruption. And then this last point, evolving with agility, that the systems and institutions are rewarded for being adaptable and being agile and thinking about these things instead of constantly, as Dan said just before, thinking historically about what has worked in the past. What has worked in the past isn't necessarily what's right for today or what's going to work in the future. And it's time to really start evaluating sectors not on what the historic norms have been, but what the future is driving them toward. And so just to sum, you can see here, effective steering requires these framework concepts, strategically diversified systems, utilizing technology with a very thoughtful approach towards equity, baseline fundamental structures of efficiency, with a mindset towards resilience and thinking about in times of shocks and change, what can we keep doing and are we ready for that? And these are the stakeholders that we know all play a role in steering the sector, the institutions themselves, governments, leadership, including academic and administrative leadership, employers, investors, innovators, all of the external actors who look to tertiary education for talent, but also for ideas and for research. We, of course, talk about students and also civil society and the impact and the relationship between civil society and institutions as being a really important one that needs to be nurtured in the future. And so in sum, we look at tertiary education with this vision of being a contributor to equitable growth, social cohesion, societies with strong democratic foundations, as well as to the success and advancement of individual students. And we see these as the benefits to individual students and these as the societal benefits of tertiary education. And with that, I will close. Thank you so much for the time today, and I hope there are some interesting questions that will come our way. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Roberta, muy completa tu presentación. Y ya con esto tenemos avanzado el desarrollo del primer panel, ¿cierto? Quiero agradecerles a todos los investigadores y académicos que están participando como panelistas en esta primera instancia. Y ahora vamos a tener unos minutos para que puedan responder las preguntas de la audiencia. Quiero explicitar que en el caso de Jennifer Ditley, ella por temas de zona horaria y diferencia horaria, ella no va a estar en este panel. En estos momentos ya es de madrugada en Australia. Entonces, por eso ella contestó las preguntas por escrito anteriormente. He seleccionado algunas preguntas que han ido apareciendo en el chat, ¿cierto? Y en el icono de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces les quiero pedir a cada uno de los participantes que esté con su cámara encendida porque voy a ir leyendo algunas preguntas. Voy a partir con una pregunta que le hacen a Trine respecto a diferencias un poco relativas a ciertos continentes. Entonces la pregunta la hace Tina Hobbins y dice, parece que Europa es más estable en la mayoría de las variables investigadas en el cambio remoto, en el cambio de educación remota en comparación con otras regiones, especialmente en las Américas. ¿Qué podría explicar eso? Por ejemplo, ¿hay diferencias en las regiones por tamaño de clase o disciplinas ofrecidas? ¿Qué hipótesis tienen de alguna forma en relación a ese tema?
Thank you very much for the question raised, and I actually think that Roberta almost partially responded with her slide on global equity challenges. I think there are several aspects, and we also have to remember that even within each region, I mean, they're composed of different countries with different systems, but I think that there is two things that I want to highlight for Europe that I think that may have played a big role. One is that Europe is typically a public funded region in terms of higher education, meaning that there are many publicly funded institutions in Europe, and even in some cases students also have free access to higher education. Of course, that depends. It's maybe partially subsidized, partially covered by fees, but I think that it is a region that has been going through this first year of pandemic with the stability in income, and I think that is one thing that is helpful. And then the second thing is the infrastructure in terms of where you are, because when this pandemic started, I think that internet penetration, access to devices, tablets, computers is much higher in Europe compared to Africa, for example, which is the region that we see in our data being the most marginalized. So you do not have the same conditions to do a shift where you all of a sudden rely on digital technologies. In the survey that we did conduct prior to the pandemic, we even saw that not all institutions were enrolling students using digital tools. So it means that for example, in Europe, the majority of institutions were already doing this prior to the pandemic. So in those countries around the world who were used to a more analog way of enrolling students, their challenges, of course, are much higher than for countries where these systems are already pre-existing prior to the pandemic. So I think that these are some of the different parameters that has an impact on the results that you see in our survey, and that made it easier for some of the institutions in Europe to respond. But again, I mean, it is a very diverse set of institutions. So we also see that some institutions are faring quite well in Africa, but there is a higher degree of diversity in the responses, where the pool of institutions in Europe are maybe a bit more similar to some extent in their replies. Veronica, I'll give it back to you.
Muchas gracias, Trine. La segunda pregunta es para Dan. Aparece en la presentación un concepto que tú ocupaste y se pregunta sobre ese concepto. Dan, ¿podrías explicarnos más sobre la educación dialéctica a la que te referiste en tu presentación? Es otra pregunta que aparece en el chat.
The dialectic is really, at the end of the day, about conversation. It's about someone or a couple of people getting together and someone has an idea, and that person states the idea. And then one or other of the listeners says, yes, that's interesting, but haven't you thought about the following? And then the original idea is modified by the statement, but, and then you create a new idea. So to use the technical language, you start off with somebody's got a thesis, they state the thesis. That is heard by somebody else who says, think about this as well, and that is called the antithesis. And then you combine those two ideas together and you get a new thesis. And the combination of the ideas together is called synthesizing the ideas. And so you improve knowledge by having someone propose something, somebody qualify it, become something new, and it goes around in a circle. Now, the advantage of that is that you're challenging people to think the whole time, as opposed to a lecture where somebody is up on the stage and they are spewing forth probably at a far too fast rate for anybody in the audience to properly understand. And then you're expecting people to either take notes or do something and know something at the end of that experience. And that doesn't work very well. But if you let people get an idea one at a time, think about it, modify it, think about it, modify it, that is the best form of learning. I hope that helped. I hope that's helpful.
Sí, muchas gracias, Dan. Y ahora viene una pregunta para Roberta. Roberta, tanto la presentación de Trine como la tuya habla del uso de analíticas de aprendizaje, ¿ya? Entonces, por un lado, una de las preguntas tenía que ver cómo usan esas analíticas de aprendizaje, qué datos recaban para tomar decisiones, y si hay datos particulares que consideran para tomar decisiones sobre equidad e inclusión en el ámbito de la educación. Esa es como la primera parte. Y la segunda parte de esta misma pregunta es, ¿qué limitaciones crees tú que tienen estos datos? Pensando qué podría mejorar de esa búsqueda de información para mejorar estos temas de equidad e inclusión.
I mean, this is a massive question. I think that the first question, the first issue about understanding learning outcomes, I mean, for the most part, policymakers need to trust academics and academic staff to know what needs to be known in their field of studies, that they are the intellectual and academic leaders of those fields, and that they can assess student learning best. And this is something that was really challenging when there was some global efforts to do learning outcomes assessments, how challenging it is to really codify something global for learning that is quite local, and that there is a lot of diversity in the delivery of academic subject at the institutional level. How a teacher teaches British literature at one university and at another one, they'll teach the same material, but they may focus on different issues. It isn't that one student will know less about British literature than the other one. It's just really difficult to say there's a single way to assess that learning across the institutions. And I think that what happens at a policy, so the bank works with policymakers. We don't work with institutions so directly. So we are constantly challenged to find indicators that say a student is learning something, and that the learning outcome is of an economic value to government spending, right? And this is a really big challenge for somebody who, like me, sees this sort of nuanced learning and the benefits of nuanced learning over the lifetime of a critically thoughtful human. It isn't necessarily something you can codify to the completion of a degree. It is about whether you taught someone to just be a really good thinker over the course of the degree program, and is it adaptive enough, right? But we are forced to look at indicators, and we do look at things like employment levels, employment satisfaction, progression into graduate school programs, things like this, any ways that you can see a human progressing in their utilization of skills, recognizing though that that's a really challenging singular entry and assessment point when we know that people are much more complicated than that. I think that's enough of an answer to the question. If I missed something, Veronica, though, just re-ask what I missed.
Está bien, gracias Roberta, porque viene después una segunda pregunta que puedes profundizar un poquitito más en eso. Bien, tengo otra pregunta para Trine. Dice, ¿es saludable para la educación superior hacer una selección de los saberes esenciales en el currículum para abordarlos en línea y dejar que los estudiantes trabajen con ellos de manera autónoma? Es una pregunta de una académica de la Universidad Católica Boliviana, María de la Luz.
Thank you very much for an interesting question. I think that it's a bit difficult to say yes or no to this question. I think that it depends very much on the context, and I think that you have to let it be up to the academics as well to, of course, plan their curriculum and how they deem it the best way to deliver it. But that put aside, I would like to respond a bit differently to the question. What I hope that this pandemic has taught us is to think a little bit differently about how we spend the time with students when they are on campus. I think that some things that we've been used to actually grouping students together in huge lecture hall for a lecture where there is no opportunity for engagement, for question and answers. In that case, then I think actually maybe an online video recording would be as efficient. It would allow the student to listen several times to the lecture, and in any case, would not be able to engage, and then use the time with the students on campus, whether it's for group work that is set up through the instructions, or whether it's for presentations, for discussions, for dialectics, as Dan is referring to. This is what I hope, this is how I hope we will think a bit differently about how the combined efforts of lectures and group discussions, well, can maybe be structured differently than how we were used to do it prior to the pandemic. So I hope that this also responds to the questions, even though I'm not saying yes or no, this is a good way of doing it.
Bien, muchas gracias, Trin. Tengo una pregunta para Dan ahora. Dice, en tu presentación, Dan, nos cuentas y nos muestras imágenes de universidades, ¿cierto? Y nos cuentas que esas universidades emulan o tratan de mostrar alguna infraestructura griega, y tú planteas que no te parece bien que las universidades de alguna forma estén tan centradas en el pasado. Y pensando un poco en el libro que escribiste, que habla de la educación del futuro, ¿qué condiciones tendría que tener esa educación del futuro? ¿Si podrías caracterizar o entregar alguna sugerencia de qué te parece a ti que deberían tener como mínimo esas universidades del futuro?
I'm not absolutely clear not absolutely clear what the questioner would like me to actually say, because the education in the future will, of course, depend on which faculty, which department, which school, whatever you want to call it, you're in. I think the key issues are that it needs to be clear as to what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to develop individuals. You're trying to develop them by opening up the world of knowledge to them, and by showing them how important knowledge is and what they can do with that knowledge, and engendering in them a belief that they're able to acquire knowledge and to use knowledge successfully. Now, the way you would do that in a course in a language as opposed to a course in engineering would be entirely different. But you would not be trying to get them. Let me say, for example, in English, when I did my first course in English, I had to read 16 books in the first year, 4 Shakespeare's, and God knows what all the other stuff was. And what did that do for me? I really didn't get a single lecture about the importance of literature and how literature underpins so many different aspects of human behavior and human understanding, and what it would mean for me to be able to appreciate this importance. We have seen education as being, there's a lovely expression, education is not about filling up the head. You can sometimes see photographs or drawings of a skull that's opened up, and that's the student, and the educator is somebody pouring something into the brain. That's not education in my view. Some people say education is about lighting a fire. I don't like that much either. But education is about getting somebody to want to be engaged in the world of the intellect, the world of understanding, and not about just force feeding. It's like the disgusting French habit of force feeding geese with food so that their livers expand or explode or something. I mean, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. It's about getting people to think in the right sort of way. I hope that helps you.
Gracias, Dan. Y hay otra pregunta para ti, y la aprovecho de hacer al tiro, en ese sentido, como que hablaste tú de la importancia de las facultades. ¿Cómo crees tú que las facultades pueden incrementar su espacio de toma de decisiones en una universidad?
Please say that again.
Sí, que se habla un poco de las facultades, que son acá en Chile se habla de la facultad como donde están las carreras de una disciplina o de un área común de disciplina, ¿cierto? Entonces, ¿cómo las facultades podrían intentar tener más capacidad de tomar decisiones dentro de una universidad respecto, como dices tú, que es diferente enseñar ingeniería?
Oh, right. Okay, got it.
Medicina?
Got it. Okay. Look, this varies from country to country, but in a lot of countries that I've worked in, and I've worked in many, universities suggest that they are democratic institutions, that the opinions of all the faculty are important, and they have departmental or school meetings, and then they have Senate meetings, and it goes on up to the Vice Chancellor, and the suggestion is, that the Vice Chancellor is very sensitive to everybody in the organization, and he listens to them, and it's a sort of the word that is used often is collegiality. Everybody, is interested in helping each other, etc. In reality, most of the universities I've worked in have been very much hierarchical. The Vice Chancellor, or the President in the Americas, you probably call him, the head, more or less gets what he or she wants. and that the instructions, commands flow down rather than the suggestions really flow up. Universities are often top-down institutions rather than bottom-up institutions. I really think that the people at the top should be more engaged with the people at the bottom, and the people at the bottom should be asked their opinion far more often. Now, it's not a question of putting out surveys or anything, but it's a question of the fact that, you know, how often does the vice chancellor actually walk around the premises and talk to the workers? The University of Witwatersrand, where I had my first chair, in which I showed you the photograph of, not the man that I was working under when I was there. He was a very aloof man, but the man before him used to walk around the campus on the weekends, and he used to pick up rubbish and put them in the rubbish bins when he saw stuff on the that hadn't been tidied up properly. I mean, he was a man who really cared about the institution, and he really cared about connecting with the institution completely. And I'm afraid that many of these people now are just very expensive, very highly paid executives. And that's not what we want. Oh, by the way, and you know, we're going to have to change at the top. The bottom can't change this very easily. This is going to have to be changed at the top. Maybe the unions might get involved. I don't know. I haven't thought about how to do it. I know there is a problem. Maybe Roberta or Trini could tell you how to change it. I can't.
Bien, muchas gracias, Dan. Y una pregunta para los tres. ¿Qué competencias serían como fundamentales para que los estudiantes deberían desarrollar en las universidades pensando en los desafíos del siglo XXI?
Who's that for?
Para los tres. Es una pregunta general.
For all three of us. All right, I'm going last, please.
I can start, and then I count on you, Dan and Roberta, to fill on. I think that one thing that I would like to just highlight, and I think that this was as well what Dan was saying with the image of the head, that you fill in knowledge. I think that we are no longer in that phase where we need to absorb a certain amount of information. We are in a phase where we need to learn how to learn. And I think this was Dan is alluding to as well, that you need to be interested in knowledge, in being engaged, in understanding the consequences, in being responsible towards society. You want to find solutions to the challenges before us, because I think that we have many as a humanity. So I think that is one thing. I think that we need critical thinking is of utmost importance, particularly in this post-truth era, that we're capable of understanding, okay, the sources of the information, comparing from different sources, trying to understand and navigating in a very complex world with a lot of different information. I think that we need innovation and creativity. And I saw a comment as well from one of the attendees here saying that the pandemic was a tremendous opportunity to show that we can always adapt and be inclusive. And I think it's true. It needs to be highlighted as well that it has been amazing to see how higher education institutions have done their utmost in order to ensure really that higher education was not discontinued. So yes, innovation and creativity, being able to think beyond what is already there and find different solutions, envisage new patterns in order to hopefully create a sustainable future. And I will let Roberta and Dan complement me.
I'll just come in a little bit. I mean, I think that we're talking more purposefully about student-centered teaching and learning, and I think this is something that institutions are going to have to be much more mindful about in their adaptations, that it isn't about what the faculty member knows, it's about what the student needs to know and what skills they need to develop, and how well that can be complementary at the institutional level. I also think that there are just many more students with many more missions, personal missions, outcome goals, attending post-secondary education now, and institutions need to recognize that. It isn't, I mean, in some countries, the vast majority still want public sector jobs, and that's fine. That's what's available in their country, and that's what's very normal. But globally, students are coming in with a wide variety of goals that they're seeking their education to serve. And a lot of that is soft skills development. Some of it really is very specific skill development. And whatever it is, there should be a place at an institution that can give them that skill. And the student, there needs to be information that aligns the student to that institution that gets them that outcome that they're seeking. And so, you know, this is a holistic space where institutions and students and teachers and administrators, all of this, they all need to be very thoughtful and purposeful about matching the students to what they seek through their education and build the skills that they're seeking from that education so that their outcomes match what they're hoping for when they enter.
Right. I did my MBA when I was 27, and in the class there was a woman who came from a very wealthy family, and at the end of it she held a party for all of us, and we went to the party. Her father was a director of a big global company, one of the biggest companies in the world, and he was wandering around talking to various students, and he came up to the little group I was with and he said, "What's the most important skill in the world?" And of course we didn't have the faintest idea what he was talking about. And then he said, "The most important skill in the world is writing, how you write." And we all said, you know, we had all been learning about all sorts of fantastic modeling and statistics and all the rest of it. And I kind of forgot about that. But I remembered it a few years ago when I was working with doctoral students and trying to get them to get their ideas down on paper so that they could present them in their dissertation. And I think that he had a really good point, except he didn't express it very well. The most important competency skill you've got is to be able to organize your thinking in such a way that you're able to communicate it to others. And the most important way of communicating ideas to others is through writing, because after we finish this thing, hardly anybody will ever remember anything anybody said. But if we'd have written it up and had it published, it is there as a record for society for a very long time. So learn how to structure your thinking and your ideas in a way, and how to reduce it to a long-lasting form like writing. Hope that's helpful.
Bien, muchas gracias a todos los panelistas. Estamos en el tiempo, pero hay un par de preguntas que quiero un poco abusar de su tiempo para poder hacerlas, ¿ya? Una pregunta es para Trine y que dice, ¿cuál es la directriz de la Asociación Internacional de Universidades sobre la universidad como institución para la sociedad?
I mean, hoping I am understanding the question correctly, at least how we see higher education institutions in all their forms as a very essential pillar of society. And I think that we also see universities as an essential pillar in order to contribute to, for example, the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. We have colleagues in the office working specifically on sustainable development and how universities are an essential partner in that process as well to responding to the global challenges, and of course looking at what it means at the local context. So if the question is whether we see the universities as an important social actor in society, then the question is yes.
Gracias, Trine. Y aquí aparece una pregunta que quizás con esto vamos a cerrar, y que dice, lo que ustedes han planteado hace que uno tenga que tener una educación bastante centrada en el estudiante, como un desafío, ¿cierto? Como más atingente a sus intereses, sus necesidades. Pero eso también a veces se torna difícil porque requiere un docente también más preparado en pedagogía, en didáctica, con grupos de clases más pequeños, como para poder establecer estos diálogos que sean problematizadores y que generen construcción del saber. ¿Cómo desde su mirada esto puede ser también factible en términos económicos, en términos de infraestructura, en términos institucionales para las distintas regiones del mundo, ¿cierto? ¿Cómo se puede pensar en conjugar de alguna forma esta enseñanza centrada en el aprendiz con todas las otras dificultades que tenemos en términos económicos, infraestructura y en competencias docentes? Y esa también es una pregunta para cerrar donde todos puedan dar su opinión.
All right, look, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely 100% right. It's all about the learner. It's not about the institution. I would almost say we should dismantle these universities and build them again properly, and build them with the student at the center of them, and not the establishment. But of course, you've touched on a very, very touchy topic, and that is this costs money. It really does. And the problem is who's going to pay. Now, I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer. I mean, that is a central question for our society today. Now, it reminds me, there's a parable that comes from, maybe it comes from Aesop's stories, I'm not sure, but the story is this: it's about the owl. The owl was the most wise of all creatures that God ever made. And this centipede comes up to the owl and it says, "Oh, owl, tell me, please answer the terrible problem I've got. I've got 100 sore feet." And the owl says, "Oh, well, that's easy to solve. He said, all you have to do is to walk 3 inches above the ground for a week and your feet will be fine." And then the centipede says, "But owl, how can I do that?" And the owl says, "Oh, get away with you. I don't want to answer the practicalities. I've told you how to do it in theory." So there are lots and lots of problems, and it's got to do with the structure of our society. And I'm so sorry the first speaker, Jennifer, isn't here, because Jennifer raised a whole load of issues that I would love to have heard explored further about more human, about being more human and all the rest of it. It is a very, very difficult question that you've asked. I hope my parable at least was entertaining.
I mean, I'll come in because this is one of the major efforts that the World Bank does. This is what I do every day, is to try to find ways to support countries in reforming their sectors so that it is more student oriented, that the outcomes are ones that match national strategic goals. This is what we do. And part of that, I mean, in this framework that I presented, this idea about diversification of institution types, part of that whole thought process is around not driving all of tertiary education, not higher education, through very expensive research universities, which are fundamentally important for every institution, every country. Every country should have spaces where important research is done, but not every student needs to be educated in that most expensive model of delivery. There are ways to teach skills that are of value and have outcomes that students are seeking through a less expensive teaching model. And some of that is, as we've been discussing this whole time, through online delivery. A lot of it just is more teacher-oriented institutions, and they exist all over the world, where it's very specific and it's very focused on what the student's learning is going to be. And that a system that has multiple forms of institutions can be more efficient in how it spends those finite resources. I mean, there are lots of legislative environments that determine how much money goes into tertiary education. Some of it is guaranteed, so it's free everywhere, and that's an extremely expensive model for countries to keep maintaining. Others don't have any regulations about that, and some of that gets crazy expensive on the other side. but it can be done in a way that's just more thoughtful about what things cost and what the value is for the student in the different learning environments, and letting students kind of find their way so that more and more students can access high quality teaching and learning, not necessarily through a single institutional modality.
Yeah, and I will also jump in here, and I think that that kind of also is linked to one of the points that I made about higher education institutes are responding to different needs of different learners. I think that we do need a very diverse higher education landscape globally, but also in the regions and within the countries. Of course, as Roberta is saying, they're responding to different demands of different learners. That is, in terms of how do we change, I think that right now we are in a pandemic where higher education institution has shown that they are capable of changing, that they are capable of adapting. So I think that right now we have to live with the different constraints of each and every context of the different governance structures that we are working under. But I think that it is still an opportunity right now to make sure that we prioritize the time to distill the lessons learned, because we have been forced really to do things differently, and some things are maybe working well and some things are not at all how we want to continue. So I think that it's really about investing time in understanding what are the opportunities in our university and our institutions that we can build on in order to improve the institutions moving forward, and what did definitely not work during this pandemic, things that are not in the same manner possible when working remotely. So my advice would really to invest time in distilling lessons learned during this pandemic.
Bien, muchas gracias a los tres por sus respuestas, y agradezco también a Jennifer, que no está en este momento, a los 4 panelistas invitados a este segundo encuentro internacional virtual en educación superior, inaugurando este primer panel, ¿cierto? Damos por terminado entonces esta sesión. Agradezco también a todos los asistentes, a los participantes, al público que quiso estar hoy día con nosotros, y los invitamos cordialmente a participar mañana en nuestro panel número 2, titulado Enseñanza, Aprendizaje y Evaluación en Educación Superior después de la pandemia, que, como digo, va a ser el día martes 23 de noviembre a las 16:20 horas, hora chilena. Les agradezco su participación y esperamos verlos mañana. Gracias.